I'm going to have a little fun because we are about to dive into policy and procedure, and we all know how exciting that can be. What I'm going to tell you is one of the things I focus on a lot in everything I do is really system thinking and looking at the wholes and then the parts. It's really easy to get myopic when we are working in what we do, but we have to understand that it's really about intersections, and that's not generally how we think. We generally platform, and then we say, this is this, and that's how it exists in time and space. I tend to see things as intersections. Think of it as like a tachometer, and that it sweeps depending on the situation. And that's generally how policies, procedures, actually all our departments work. If we look at things more as intersections, and I have a series of Venn diagrams that I won't bore you with, but I love, that actually kind of point that out, how different things intersect. And that's what we're going to talk about today, how a policy and procedure, actually a federal law, FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, intersects with each of you. And it intersects with all of us differently. It really, really does. And so what I'm going to tell you is that most of us get our introduction in education to FERPA by some type of online program that is assigned to us by our school district or our agency, and we sit down and we get to listen to this. And generally, it is an amazing voice that narrates what FERPA is, and we get this great overview and go, I think I understand the federal law now. And the reality is not even close. You know, I've been assigned our FERPA presentation several times, and each time I go, I hope this year they explain that law enforcement units are part of education. And every time I get out knowing that, well, the most common way that FERPA is violated in education is through oral conversations. And so most people center on the data, but most of the time it's oral conversations. And that is really interesting when it comes to the intersection of FERPA and law enforcement units. But I digress. I'm getting ahead of myself. And so how many of you in here have heard of FERPA? How many of you have been beat over the head with, you can't have that because it's FERPA? Generally, it's somebody in my position. If the IT guy is saying, oh, we can't give that to you, or maybe it's a school attorney saying, hey, we have to redact that. And then they turn to the IT guys and we go, we can't redact that. I don't have the time. They need it right away. And so there's nuance to everything, you know. And so I want you to understand that for most people in here, we have to think of FERPA as just a series of checkpoints that we traverse through, making sure that as we go through them, we understand the situation that we are in to be able to access that information. And so instead of looking at it as kind of this barrier, I like to start out and set the foundation of this is a right afforded to parents and students, period. This is just like you like to hug and embrace your rights, this is one of their rights. And it's our responsibility to honor that right as we do our work. Pretty simple. And I can tell you, if in the broad scheme of things, if it's a health and safety issue, you've got nothing to worry about. That information can traverse from person to person freely. And so, and we'll get into the nuance of this, but I think really the mindset has to be in that other space where we're asking for information, and it really isn't, you know, an eminent situation or in that health and safety and how that goes. And this is where it gets really blurry. And by the time we are done, this will be clear as mud. And you'll say, why did we even bring that guy in? Because he didn't tell me what I need to do. He just gave me all these questions and answers to go back to my district with and work with them. And that's where you intersect with them. Because most districts, and with all due respect to them, don't really understand FERPA. They over-redact, under-redact, and don't even understand that most of this is codified through policy and procedure on their websites, and that's where you start looking where there's those intersections happening. And when it comes to the law enforcement units, that it's the MOUs that they've built, hopefully, that are in place that dictate what you can do and what you can't do. Okay? So what is FERPA? It was an act that was established by Congress in 1974. And if you go, I challenge you to go back to your school, if you're a school district employee or if you work with the school district, and go look at the FERPA statement. Anyone here from Yakima School District? Can we just drop the camera feed for just a second? Our FERPA statement looks like a 1974 FERPA statement. It hasn't been updated in a while. It's really doesn't harken back to 1974. But generally, they're rarely looked at until, I don't know, somebody sues a school district. That gets our attention, and then we start making sure that we're in adherence. And I am not, I know I'm saying all this tongue in cheek, but we all have a lot on our plates, and we prioritize those things. So I'm not maligning any school district. I'm not maligning any agency. You know, we are dealing with everything on our plates and then some. And I know for me, this thing called the pandemic kind of got in the way of a lot of things I used to do. And so I'm a big policy and procedure guy. And I used to kind of beat that drum. And you know, now I kind of go, a lot of my policies and procedures need to be updated too, and I've not had the time. And so what FERPA protects is what is generally known as student information and that is held in student records. And so we'll get into that, but it's mandated by the federal government. It applies to any agency getting federal funds. So some private schools get federal funds. I know that Yakima School District works with some private schools, and we help them apply for federal areas in like LAP. And so it would apply to them, but it doesn't apply to everybody. But I can tell you, if you are a public school, it applies to you. You are receiving, unless you have some great endowment, you are receiving federal monies to, you know, provide the services you provide. And then also, it doesn't just apply blanket to any student. The student has to be eligible in that educational institution. And so it's just not they're a student, FERPA applies. That's not the case. And we'll get into some of the nuance of this moving forward. But simply put, you know, FERPA is the parent's right to have access to their student records, and authorized consent is required before you can disclose school records in accordance with FERPA. What that doesn't say is there's an obligation of the educational institution to be transparent and also give parents an indication of what that data are and how you're using it, how you're transferring it, and give them opportunities to interact with that data. So as an educational institution, we have a right to create policies and procedures around that. So educational records can include report cards, surveys, health unit records, assessments, specialized records, disciplinary records, information about parents, personal identification information, PII, we'll keep saying that over and over and over again, and correspondence between school and students. Examples of directory information, lists of student names, addresses, telephone numbers, and also student ID, which includes an electronic identifier. So it used to be in my area, we used to use student IDs as an email address. And then we kind of all woke up and went, wait a minute, we can't do that. Chris remembers that time. And then we all had to change and create these cryptic things that now nobody can remember, and students struggle to remember as well. So again, it's those intersections. And it can't be used, and it cannot be used to gain access to educational records fields of study, grade levels, enrollment status, dates of attendance or degrees, honors, and awards and received. So directory information consists of information that would not generally be considered an invasion of privacy. So we have PII in one column, directory information in the other column, and I kind of blurred them there as I traversed through it, so I want to make sure we understand what it is. So directory information you can use however you want, and actually schools are required to publish in their FERPA statement what is directory information. What are the things that we consider directory information and we're going to share as directory information? So that should be on your website somewhere, in a policy somewhere that outlines that. On the other side is PII, which are things like social security numbers, telephone, email addresses, potentially, if they're constructed in a way that gives that information out. And so PII is really information that should be kept private, and really you think about it as if that information that you're giving out can link to a student from any reasonable person's perspective, that intersection, then it's probably PII. If me, average Joe Andy Gonzalez, 5'3", you give me some information, I say, oh, that's that student. That is PII, because you can disaggregate them from the data. So educational records can include things like video. And it's funny, because when I did this, film and tape, who's dealt with film and tape? I was like, I'm the IT guy, film and tape. I say that because things are ever evolving, and even as we're kind of traversing through these and we're looking through our source materials, we still say things that none of us have touched in a long time. And so, you know, film and tape, and they're items that, as an educational institution, are recorded into an educational record of a student. And so, you know, these can be things within our student information system. So we use Skyward at Yakima School District, so we'll be talking about some of our SIS, student information systems. But also it's those things that are in file cabinets. And also, I know for us, where we intersect with law enforcement as IT, is we provide a lot of electronic data. And so we have an obligation to make sure that the systems we use really only allow access under those rules that we've set forth in policy and procedure. And I'm not trying to be cryptic here, but they're different for every agency. And so if I tell you what we do, it might not be what you do, but hopefully what I'm inspiring is some collaboration. Remember that systems thinking discussion, where you and your organization start looking at where you're intersecting and where you may be covered and where you may need to cover. So, and so not everything in a student record also falls under FERPA. And so again, if it isn't PII, so personally identifiable information, it could be in their educational record, but it might not be under the FERPA umbrella. So again, this is really that discussion about, even though something is in the educational record, FERPA doesn't necessarily always cover it. And I know you can read, and I don't have a whole lot of time, so I was shorted on time, is what I was told. Oh no, they gave me 5'3" worth of time, so my cup is 5'3" full. And so again, really, it's what we can disclose, how we can disclose it, and it's in those two categories. What we've listed as directory information, what we've told our parents, hey, you need to be aware that this is what we're going to share and who we're going to share it with. And if you want to opt out, which is an important part of the FERPA legislation, that you can opt out. So most of that opting out happens in the curriculum side. So if we're going to use a certain product, and we have a FERPA notification, we send it out to our parents, and they have the option of saying, I don't want my data there. But they also have the option of saying, can I inspect that data, see what you're actually doing with it, and then make that decision. So again, we have a lot of intersections, and so my goal is really just to tell you, go out, find your path, and then figure out where you might have gaps in that. And so really the standard is this. A person can have access to that information if they have a legitimate educational interest. So, as the IT person, I have a legitimate interest in some things that we hear aren't allowable when it comes to student data because it does pertain to the work I do, like free and reduced information. Because I file for E-rate for our district, I get some access to it. Did I get all the access? No. And so one of the things that's really important about most policies and procedures is the measure to which it's upheld to, and that is reasonable. And I think most of us can traverse through reasonable. And so it must be reasonably protected. And so if you've ever wondered why when you log into Skyward you don't see everything, or your student information system, it's because that's how that definition of reasonable comes into play. If everyone had access to everything, well, that would be a FERPA violation. But by creating hierarchies of access, that's how we get that legitimate educational interest and reasonably protected. And so, again, I'm an IT guy, hyperlinear, generally really boring, and just traverse through discussions like lines of code. So if you're yawning, sleeping, I apologize. Like I said, we didn't set the bar very high, so I know I'm not letting you down. So every year, a district has an obligation to publish its FERPA statements. And so they have a notice that they send out, usually in a student handbook. They review their websites, make sure that that's happening. Some of them will categorize their FERPA notifications, like this is what we're doing in digital curriculum areas, this is what we're doing in law enforcement unit areas. And so ours has a series of checkboxes that parents can opt in and out in various areas. And so that makes it more complex for us to track, but it also, I think, holds higher to the standard of what FERPA was intended to do. And so we also have to define who is a school official, and the part that applies to why we're here is an MOA that discusses our law enforcement agreements, and whether that's internal to our organization or external with other law enforcement agencies. And so this is where we're at. Educational records, like I said at the beginning, generally when I don't think, and I know this is common knowledge, so this isn't where the issue occurs. It's in the health and safety emergency area. It's really in those other areas that we'll talk about. And so if it's a health and safety emergency, that information can flow freely in accordance with any laws that pertain to those acts when they're in the general public, so in that public domain. And so the other area that sometimes is discussed is that schools have to comply with judicial orders or court orders or subpoenas when it comes to releasing student data. Again, none of this is rocket science. If it's legal and there's a health and safety emergency, that information can flow. But this is where things get really, really convoluted, and it's really, what is a law enforcement unit? When we think of law enforcement units, we think of our commissioned officers in our communities, but under the definition of FERPA and under schools, law enforcement units are generally detailed, and they're the people providing that service in our institutions. Sorry, I keep creating feedback and I know better. And so it doesn't mean that it's just YPD for us. It means that it's our SROs, potentially, if we've defined them as such. I'm going to bring up a name, YPD, that's probably a little painful. I know it's painful for me. Like Nate Henyon. If you don't know who Nate Henyon is, former YPD officer who came to work for the Yakima School District. Not a funny joke, but he'll find it funny, especially when he realizes it's on camera. And so it's defining those people who are designated as with those duties and defined as such in their organizations. And so some larger school districts cover it with hired employees. Others do not. And it doesn't matter. It just means that it has to be defined. And remember that MOA? That MOA has to explain what we are doing in those instances with those people. And so when you carefully define your law enforcement units, it does afford you an ability to share information in a manner that, like me, as a district employee, can't. And so when a law enforcement unit is defined, they have access, if it's defined in, like, to our student information system, sorry, keep doing that, and they can share that freely with law enforcement under, less regulation by FERPA. So in our group, we've actually defined that. And so if Nate and Sarah pull that information, they can freely share it as they are defined as our law enforcement units with others because they get it, they've stored it in separate areas, and we have separate protocols and procedures for that. Then if they were to ask a principal or somebody else to pull it, and then potentially it becomes an educational record, and then everything is umbrellaed under FERPA. But it's not that easy. And so what you can have is a file or an article that started out in one area that ends up in another. And so for us, generally, that transpires of, we have an issue in one of our buildings. Nate pulls that file, and he starts sharing that file. As they've go through the investigation, they realize that there's some discipline that needs to be handed out. And so that file then is provided to the building administrator, and that building administrator uses it to issue discipline, and now that has become an educational record. And so you can see where it can live in both worlds. What I will tell you is that for, I think, school officials, where we run afoul of this, and so here's my cautionary tale, the lesson we learned the hard way, is that archival is critical to being able to traverse through this. So if you have a record in an LEU process that doesn't archive, and then it's needed in another area, or it needs to be forwarded to other law enforcement agencies, I'm going to tell you that that isn't their forte. And so developing those systems, if you're in IT or in those roles, is important because we've been fortunate in that I work with another group of even more linear guys who looked at this and went, you know what, we need a central archival, and then we'll delegate out the permissions from there, but we always retain a copy, and they're blind copies based on the permission structure that we've set forth. And one person can pull from either, and that seems to satisfy our archival standard. But archival is a big piece of what you guys do in education that often falls short. An example is we've handed over video, and I'm not saying we've done this, it's the universal we, to law enforcement. As an educational institution, we assume they are archiving it, and they assume we are archiving it, and that intersection isn't defined. And then it ends up in court. Sound familiar to any law enforcement people? And they asked for that copy. And if your law enforcement unit isn't archiving and your educational unit isn't archiving, and that becomes the need, you could end up going, yeah, we don't have that anymore. Sorry. And so important is, as we traverse and intersect in this space, and I know that doesn't have anything to do with FERPA, but again, System Think's kind of backing up and sharing what we've learned as we've traversed through this in those moments, I think is more important than telling you something that you could literally look up and read. And so for me, it's really imparting these lessons that we've learned that may or may not apply, but definitely intersect. And archival is one that I think catches a lot of organizations off guard. And it extends even to our fire departments. We've had cases of arson that have occurred. We hand over the video. We think they're archiving it. They think we are archiving it. And again, this is a global we. I'm not talking about Yakima School District in particular. And suddenly there's a need because it ends up in court and nobody has a copy of it anymore. And that's an actual scenario that has happened. And so I think we all look at each other and we go, no, 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 that can't happen, but it does. People are moving quickly and we think systems and processes are in place that will account for this, but they may or may not be. And I'm not casting any judgment on any institution or organization, but we all move at 100 miles an hour. And so it just gets dropped. And so here's what's not under FERPA. And so remember when I said that FERPA, one of the major violations is in oral communications. You're talking to somebody. Do you know that XYZ family, qualifies for free and reduced lunch, and there's no really need for that information to be shared with the custodian of that building. Not knocking them, I'm just saying there's no legitimate need to know. And that happens. But where it doesn't apply is in these communicated threats of violence, threatening behavior, so unusual or significant disruptive behavior, stalking, harassment, intimidation, bullying, or suicidal ideation. So things that you observe or hear are not subject to FERPA. It can be moved forward. They're not part of an educational record. They're part of this record. And so they don't apply. FERPA doesn't apply. And so you can freely share that. So if you hear of a potential threat in a building, you can share that threat. And again, it's really, the intent of FERPA is not to limit. It's to provide a right, and then we have an obligation to just understand it to know when we can do it. Because I've heard things like, well, we can't share that. It's FERPA related. Yes?
In relation to a threat, so if a student has prior documented events of threats or a situation kind of like that, and then you become aware of a new one, is sharing that record that was documented in the past, is that a violation?
Generally, that is okay. So, and you can share that with law enforcement. And I say generally because, again, it's situational and you really have to assume it. So let's say you have knowledge of or overheard a conversation and you start looking into it, you do your investigative process, you go, oh, there's a pattern of behavior here. If you are falling under that health and safety emergency, you're good to go, always. Remember that. Our goal is to protect our stakeholders in our environments that we work in. Where it gets a little more convoluted is, what is it that is documented and what is the urgency of the information that you are hearing? So does that make sense? Because it could be, I'm going to blow up this building and all the barriers fall away. But if it's, I remember one time participating in a conversation where a student was narrating something about a video game, and it was interpreted as a threat. And that would not apply because we have an obligation to kind of really pay attention and source through that. And so what they were doing in a video game is very different than what they intended to do here. So again, clear as mud, situational awareness, really making sure that we're in tune. And I will tell you, my fallback is always ask legal counsel. Always. I mean, they're going to guide you through it. They're going to know what's in your organization's documents. And so I don't want to be your legal counsel. What I want to do is just kind of tell you, this is really, really complex. And I don't know your organization. And I don't know your policies and procedures, but you're required by law to have them, and you should start working, intersecting, remember my platform versus intersecting, with them to get an understanding, and look at where you actually formally intersect, look at where you need to intersect, and start taking that Venn diagram and pushing them together to where that intersection actually matches what is needed. Does that make sense? So on this page, there's a long list, which you'll get a copy of this, and I know that everyone in here can read. And so really it comes down to, you have to have those policies and procedures. You have to train your people on what those procedures are. And most of our organizations undersell this. So again, it's what I started out with. You get assigned that FERPA training. It covers nothing of anything we've discussed here. Probably doesn't even tell you about law enforcement units. And you go off thinking, I know FERPA. And your colleagues go off and read that and use it differently. Some people weaponize it. I know I've been in meetings where I was beat over the head with FERPA. And in the end, it's really making sure that we all have an understanding of what's in our policies and procedures, what's in that yearly communication to our parents, what we're defining as directory information, and who we're defining as members of our law enforcement organizations, and what our MOAs say we can do. Pretty simple. I give you a flow chart for access. You can't read that, but you'll get a copy of this. And what I will tell you is all of this is from the Department of Ed. So I am not telling you anything that you couldn't go out. I'm hopefully giving it to you in a nice package that has minimal typos and is easier to read than, I think this is like a 28-page document for them. And so I feel the best way to learn is being curious. And so when I do system think and leadership talks, curiosity is an overlooked process that really informs leadership and process and policies and procedures. And so the more curious we are, the better we are. And so for me, a Q&A section is the best way to, I think, really define this. Now, I'm not going to go through this because, again, this is available for you, and you're probably tired of my voice and going, boy, you weren't right. You set the bar pretty low, buddy. Anybody could have done this. In the end, these are conversations and questions you should be having with members of your organization and saying, hey, how do we answer this question? And what do we think about this? And so if I was looking at the intersections that are happening, and who has to be at the table when you're having these discussions, obviously safety and security and members of your law enforcement units, legal counsel, probably whoever's in charge of your policies and procedures, and then the often overlooked guys are the IT guys. Because they are generally the people who are setting up the processes behind the scenes that help the information flow and the access. Not always. Sometimes you have data center groups and others, but somebody from that group that can say, hey, when we say that and we need that archival or we need that access, here's how that looks. And here's the granularity that can be provided. And let's look at it through the lens of what we can actually do as we overlay FERPA over that reasonable access. And so that's what I'm saying. And so you'll see, I really like being curious, lots of questions, lots of answers. But really for me, what I can share with you over the years is really where I started. We are all really busy. And we are all really dedicated to what we do. And it's really easy in those moments to just look at things from one perspective. And we have to back up. Again, look at the parts, This is what we call system thinking. But look at the wholes as well. And start looking at where we intersect with this topic. And I'm not saying FERPA, I'm saying safety and security, and then we overlay FERPA over safety and security. Because that's where the conversations become interesting, and that's where you find the gaps. Because I can tell you, through personal experience, there's nothing worse than being on the stand and having to go, yeah, we gave that out, or we don't have that anymore, or how did you get that? These are true things that happen all the time. And again, I'm not saying people set out to do this on purpose. They just don't understand their intersections. And so literally in our organization, because of some dry-witted 5'3" guy, we sit down and we Venn diagram everything out. I mean, literally Venn diagram everything out. It's a running joke in my district when we go to a meeting. Is there going to be a Venn diagram? Yes, there's going to be a Venn diagram. And then we overlay what we need, and we look at those intersections to make sure they are where they are. Because some people are visual. You know, I love policy and procedure. I can write it all day long. I can read it all day long, but not everyone can translate it the way that it needs to. And ultimately, I think if we're all being honest in here, when most of us are handed a handbook of policy and procedure, we kind of look at it, weigh it, yeah, I get this, and we set it aside. Or maybe just highlight the areas that we think apply to us and don't really get the full understanding. And so my goal here is not to really give you anything other than FERPA exists, we have an obligation to adhere to it, and let's start working with our other teams to understand those intersections, because we may be, in some cases, missing access that we are afforded, or in other cases, over-participating in areas where we shouldn't. How much time do I have? Okay, all right. So, any questions? Anything? Yeah.
I just kind of curious, how long has FERPA been around?
Since 1974.
Okay.
And there have been updates to it. Most significant was some guidance, not really an update, in 2019, where they actually started folding in guidance for law enforcement units. And actually that's most of where this came from. And actually this document is cited at the end, because I don't want you to think that it was this genius brain that created it, because you know better. You got to see me in person. So you can click on those links and get that information firsthand.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just curious, because it seems like there's a lot of similarities between FERPA and the medical profession's HIPAA.
Yep. Okay, so that's a great question. So this is where, again, there's misconception about HIPAA and FERPA. So in schools, FERPA supersedes HIPAA. There almost isn't HIPAA. That does not include contractors that are providing like SLP services where there is medical billing to Medicaid. They have an obligation to HIPAA. Oh my gosh, remember this clear as mud? And you can tell I love this stuff, because why else would an IT guy know what is HIPAA and not when it comes to medical billing and Medicaid and third-party vendors? But there's also great guidance on that. And actually, what I'll do is I'll email that to Chris and have him link that as well, because there's actually a HIPAA-FERPA joint document out there that really, really explains this, gives some great scenarios. So we have a health center, clear as mud again, and we provide health services. So if we store medical records, we are subject to HIPAA. If we store educational records, well, FERPA. So, and we collaborate with other agencies, and so we make sure that there is a defined educational record on our part, because I don't want to have to. And it's not that I don't want to do HIPAA compliance, because I'm on camera. I would do HIPAA compliance all the time. It's just training people to do it, because that's really where HIPAA is. It's not some magical technology that your IT guy applies and says, there's a button, apply HIPAA compliance, and it permeates throughout your organization. What it is, and that's what FERPA is. It's why we have these trainings and why we're having the conversation the way we're having it, is it's these discussions and these trainings that have to happen so that people understand what their obligations are. It's where I started out. We have an obligation to honor those rights of those parents, those students. And I say parents and students, and just for clarity, it's in this. At age 18, FERPA traverses from parent and student to the student only. So then parents may be subject to FERPA on their requests, which is really interesting. So that's the answer to the question in a long, drawn-out Venn diagram kind of verbal way.
All right. Well, thank you, Andy. Round of applause for Andy Gonzalez. Thank you, my friend.